quite a while now, one semi-popular request for an addition to Dead by Daylight has been Slenderman, the king of the 2010s internet creepypastas. With the wide mythos and childhood nightmares from this formally dressed, faceless figure, it's no wonder that he's been so widely requested. However, I have an alternative chapter in mind that would fulfill the dream of Slenderman in Dead by Daylight while also having a more complete chapter idea, all from the web series that gave the creepypasta many of his most recognizable attributes. The video distortion, memory loss, sickness, the infamous pages. All of it originates not from Victor Surge's original posts, but instead from the first ever web series produced revolving around the creature. I present to you, Dead by Daylight, the Marble Hornets Chapter. In 2009, Jay Merrick posted an introductory video to the newly created Marble Hornets channel. He explains that 3 years prior, his college friend Alex Crayley had abruptly canceled a student film project titled Marble Hornets due to unworkable conditions on set. Alex told Jay that he planned to burn all of the tapes from the project, but Jay managed to convince him to hand them over as long as Jay never spoke of it again. Alex moved away, and Jay had forgotten about the tapes until this point. He explains that he plans to view the tapes in order to figure out what had caused Alex to react so strongly, and will post any findings to the channel. Jay immediately discovers the origin of Alex's paranoia. A tall, faceless man in a suit, who seems to be following Alex everywhere, appearing at his house, on set, and when walking his dog. As these occurrences increase in frequency, Alex grows more paranoid and agitated. He begins filming himself constantly and becomes hostile toward his crew. Jay decides to search for Alex, concerned for his friend and too deep into the investigation to stop. He grows more paranoid and begins filming himself, just like Alex, as increasingly strange things happen to him. A channel named To The Ark also begins responding to Jay's videos with its own, full of codes, odd imagery, and strange audio, along with a name for the creature Alex was seeing, the Operator. Jay begins seeing the Operator himself, and his investigation causes him to lose his memory several times, and results in multiple encounters with a strange masked man. He's all but ready to quit the investigation when he receives a tape in the mail, with recent footage of Alex and his girlfriend being attacked by the Operator. Jay resolves to find Alex and goes radio silent for an extended period of time. 7 months later, Jay wakes up in a hotel with no memory of anything since the last entry. He meets a girl named Jessica in an adjoining room and, just as he's attempting to piece things together through investigation of a nearby park, is attacked by the masked man. He manages to escape and takes with him several tapes from a safe that detail the events of the past 7 months. Jay had found Alex, who asked Jay for help finding his girlfriend Amy, who disappeared after the Operator attack in the tape Jay received in the mail. However, Alex was taking so long to contact Jay that Jay began picking up the investigation on his own, causing tension between the two even as the Operator appeared near both of them. A strange-hooded man, part of To The Ark's group along with the masked man, also begins stalking Jay and harassing Alex. Things reach a boiling point in the park Jay had found prior, leading to Jay running away to the hotel with Jessica, only for an Operator attack to wipe both of their memories, bringing everything back to the present. The third season begins with Jay recruiting Tim, an actor from the original project, to help him under the pretense of finishing Alex's film from years ago. Tim gives Jay his own tapes from behind the scenes of the original project, and the two begin searching old filming locations from the project. Things become complicated when the hooded man begins showing up more and more frequently, and Tim discovers that Jay isn't telling him the full truth. This is as far as I can summarize the series without major spoilers, and that's not even getting into the sequel comic series. However, you might have noticed something about the summary. The Operator isn't mentioned often, and when it is, it's only to appear and sometimes attack the characters, then disappear for a while longer. This isn't bad summary writing on my part. It's reflective of the Operator's actual physical presence in the series. In the entire 9.5-hour runtime of the series, the Operator only shows up for about 7 minutes combined across all 3 seasons. When it appears, it barely moves, and when it attacks people, the worst that happens is they have a seizure, become temporarily catatonic, and lose their memory, with each subsequent encounter worsening the result. Despite the low frequency and actual appearances, its presence bleeds through the entire series. It shows up in the first few entries for a few seconds at a time, and those entries establish that it can be anywhere, at any time, usually in the background, almost always out of direct view, and often accompanied by video and audio distortion. Even after the operator begins showing up less and less, every split second of distortion, every shot of trees, every dark scene, you're scanning the background for the faceless man like a Redditor searching for Goku on a post with a red circle. You know the operator is there, even if you can't see it, because you know how it's affecting the characters more and more as the series progresses. The question then becomes, how on earth do you take a creature that revolves around psychology and physical inaction and put it in a video game that boils down to a glorified game of tag with spaghetti code? To answer this, I have another piece of media to discuss. Ringu. Ringu is already in Dead by Daylight. Sadako is a somewhat popular, if weak, killer in the game. Sadako's presence in her original film is comparable to the operator's presence in Marble Hornets. Her presence is established in the cold open, but she isn't named until far later on. She appears for the first time over halfway through, but only in a flashback, and her only true appearance is in the famous TV kill scene. Her curse is the driving force of the film, but what we see of her hardly gives her enough material to be transferred into our beloved game of Scooby-Doo chases. Despite this, she was translated into the game far better than I would have thought possible, even with its balance issues. Sadako's transition into Dead by Daylight was far more smooth visually than it was balance-wise. The developers worked around the problem of a character who hardly does anything physical in her source media by utilizing her psychic abilities in all of her animations. She breaks objects with psychic pulses, attacks and lifts survivors with subtle movements, and pulls the hooks down in order to lift the survivors onto them. Her most famous scene is visually recreated with every teleport, and the static effects and sounds are phenomenal at invoking the television and tape imagery from the film. Where she struggles is in the realm of balance, and this is due to the biggest issue with translating an almost purely psychological killer into the game. Her curse, the condemned mechanic in-game, is a passive ability, and passive abilities have a history of balance issues in this game. While they can work well thematically, the balance swings between being overwhelming and flimsy. The biggest reason for this is that the value obtained from it is almost entirely out of the killer's hands, and changing the killer's handle on the value will far too often swing the balance into the killer's favor in excess of what is reasonable. Sadako herself has suffered from this greatly. Her condemned mechanic has received several major changes since her release. The original ability was far too weak, and Sadako herself had no control over it, as any action around the mechanic was entirely on the survivor. However, when it was balanced with the intention of giving Sadako more control, it gave rise to a far stronger Sadako who had more control than she was meant to have over this ability. She was able to force condemned kills via rapid teleportation, allowing for extreme cases where she could win a game without even hooking anyone. This was changed yet again, and while her condemned mechanic is in a much more healthy spot in terms of balance, it's still very weak. The operator could logically suffer from these same problems far more easily than I'd like to admit. Animations can be solved with just a bit of creativity. While it moves very little, it has still moved. Its movements are clearly not human, hovering more near the realm of uncanny valley than anything else. I would contrast the operator's potential movements with the Unknown's animations. The Unknown moves like a creature trying to pose as a human, but lacking the full knowledge of how to do so. In contrast, the operator isn't attempting to appear human. It moves sort of like a human, but clearly isn't, which matches its appearance of being sort of human, but at the same time clearly lacking humanity. It moves stiffly and bends at slightly odd angles, with the most human movement it exhibits being slight tilts of the head a la Michael Myers. Utilizing the uncanny valley-esque nature of the operator's appearance, as well as shadows and static in its attacks and destruction, can solve the issue of animations in the same way that the use of Sadako's psychic abilities was the solution to the lack of physical activity in her own home media. However, when it comes to a killer power, the operator needs far more thought put into it. By far, the best killer powers in the game in terms of both strength and a pleasant game experience all allow the killer to have full agency over the usage of their power. It forces the survivors to play against the power rather than around the power. To put it in simpler terms, the survivors play around the power through direct interaction with the killer rather than doing side quests to prevent negative consequences. This is an extremely broad generalization, and obviously the idea of a fun power is subjective, but common consensus is a very useful tool when analyzing a video game. an experience more commonly considered fun is a far better idea to implement than something commonly considered boring or tedious. Discussing examples would be a bit of a tangent, but I will list the killers, for the sake of a supporting argument, who I am referring to. The nurse. While being far too strong for her own good, and being downright overpowered in this game, is still a very interactive killer, and can be a very fun experience at mid to low levels. In a similar vein, Blight, while being very strong, is a very interactive killer and can be quite fun to go against in certain situations. Spirit is another high-tier killer who used to be incredibly strong and has been nerfed and is now in a much better state balance-wise, while also being interactive and can be fun to play against. Wesker and Chucky are two more examples of somewhat high-tier killers who are interactive and can be considered quite fun to play against in most cases. Finally, Huntress is another killer, considered high-tier at high levels, with a very simple power that is quite interactive to play against. I could go on, but you get the idea. Now keep in mind, I am by no means an expert in game balance. I am not a game developer. I play this game casually, and there are many players who are more knowledgeable on these ideas than I am. The perspective of a casual player, though, accounts for the majority of the player base, so don't discredit me or any other casual player entirely. With that disclaimer out of the way, we are almost ready to move on to the operator's power. First, though, I have to talk about the operator in the series a bit more. Specifically, this section will contain major spoilers for the web series and minor spoilers for the sequel comic series. There's really no way around it. Actually, the rest of the discussion is pretty much impossible without spoilers, so I would recommend watching Marble Hornets in its entirety before proceeding. From this point forward, I will be speaking with the assumption that everyone watching is aware of the whole plot up until the comics. If you're confused, you may want to watch the series yourself in order to have full comprehension moving forward. Ready? Here we go. The comics have the most straightforward explanation for the nature of the operator, though it is admittedly not supremely clear. In the 4th issue, Scully, a being who absorbs the operator's victims into himself and wants to stop the operator, says this.
It is a disease. It finds a crack in your mind. It crawls inside and never lets go. A parasite. It will consume you bit by bit, and it swallows your empty shell in the ark.
The operator is a sickness, a contagious mental illness. Scully himself admits that he doesn't know how it spreads to some and leaves others unaffected, meaning that even our most reliable source when it comes to the operator isn't entirely sure of some things. But what we do know is this. The operator acts as a disease, worming its way into the mind of a person with seemingly no rhyme or reason behind who it chooses. It spreads from the affected individual to others around, driving them insane and pushing them to kill themselves and each other. Also, it can appear when the job is done and carry the broken shell back to the Ark to consume it. The Ark is a major aspect of the Marble Hornets lore. The mysterious figures behind To the Ark are obsessed with it, to the point where the name of their channel references it. Alex's last name can be scrambled to produce Ark Lie, though this is possibly a coincidence. So what exactly is the Ark? We see it in Marble Hornets comic issue 3.5, To the Ark. The Ark is an alternate dimension of sorts, composed of an abyss extending in all directions, with fleshy ground and a giant rumbling hole in the center, the hole itself full of what is presumably water, though considering the setting, there's no real way to be sure what the liquid actually is. Walking into the darkness away from the center will inevitably lead back to the hole no matter what. Any victims of operator sickness who are driven insane and or killed are eventually delivered there, and the hooded man's internal monologue implies that this happens multiple times before the final trip, where he wonders how many times Jay had been in the Ark prior to his eventual death. At least some of the bodies that arrive in the Ark are slowly absorbed into the ground, as we see happening to Jay. Others seem to be simply wandering endlessly through the Ark, roaming until their inevitable digestion. Alex isn't being absorbed when Brian sees him, and Brian himself seems more coherent than any other victim within the Ark. He's only trapped because he's dead, and was affected by the operator, and he knows this. He even defiantly tells the Ark that it will never have him, though whether it could actually be possible for him to resist the Ark for an indefinite amount of time without going even more insane is questionable. This tells us that the state in which victims arrive in the Ark can vary substantially, but the result is always the same. Scully counteracts this, removing the victims by absorbing them into himself with the express purpose of starving the Ark. The operator is either an extension of the Ark that gathers food, or acts like an ant delivering food to the anthill, belonging to the Ark but not being a direct part of it. The Ark acts as the final destination for operator victims, while also possibly acting as multiple stops along the way. No matter what, the infected will end up in the Ark in the end. Using what we've discussed up to this point, we can craft an idea for the operator's power in the game. It needs to be interactive and give the killer agency, allowing for the value received to be reliant on the player's skill. It also needs to keep the psychological aspect that the operator's character relies on, and it must involve the operator's key traits in the series, as well as the Ark. The two most important things to keep in mind are keeping the operator's identity from the series intact and making the power enjoyable for both sides, at least broadly. It also bears repeating that I am not a game developer, and I am not an expert in game balance. Numbers can and probably should be tweaked, so I've allowed for some leeway on as many aspects as possible in order for balance changes to be made freely. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. First, the operator has a standard 32-meter terror radius and 115% movement speed. It is a tall killer, one of the tallest out of the whole roster, with height comparable to Nemesis or thereabouts. The operator's power is called To the Ark, and it is composed of several abilities that will give the operator map pressure and mobility, anti-loop, slowdown, and information. The first ability is called Ark Walking. The operator can press Control to become invisible to survivors, causing the player's vision to desaturate and adding static to the edge of the screen, similar to a demanifested Sonico. The operator can stay invisible indefinitely, but cannot attack and is granted greatly increased movement speed while invisible. After the operator chooses to become visible via the same button, the operator cannot attack for a brief period, slightly longer than it takes for the undetectable effect to fade away, so that the terror radius will always appear before the operator is able to attack. However, the operator can interact with pallets, breakable walls, generators, boon totems, and lockers. The operator can also only become invisible or visible when a survivor's camera is not facing in the operator's direction, meaning the operator can only appear outside of a survivor's vision or behind cover. After becoming visible, the ability goes on cooldown for 15 seconds. If this is too short or too long, it can be altered. However, if a survivor is looking at the operator, the power recharges faster. The grace period for survivors in which the operator cannot attack serves as balance for the on-demand mobility and information for patrolling gens, as well as preventing it from being used as a chase tool similar to Wraith, Sodico, or Spirit, since the survivor would have a severe lack of counterplay if that were the case. This ability removes the downsides of those abilities while coming at the cost of not being at all viable as a chase tool. It removes Wraith's shimmer and his slowdown and bell noise when decloaking, removing Sodico's partial visibility and lullaby, and removing Spirit's directional audio while retaining the ability to see survivors, as well as appearing and disappearing happening instantly. The operator's second ability is called Operator Sickness, and acts as the slowdown ability for the killer. Right away, I will admit that this is the aspect of the power I am least sure about in terms of balance. At the moment, the idea is this. While arc walking, pressing M2 allows the operator to select one of the survivors in the match to tag. The tagged survivor receives a 10% debuff to healing speed, generator repair speed, and totem cleansing speed, as well as receiving periodic coughing fits that cancel repairing, healing, cleansing, or blessing actions until the coughing is over. The operator can change which survivor is tagged at any time while arc walking without any cooldown, apart from the arc walking cooldown itself. If the tagged survivor is downed, instead of being hooked, they will automatically be sent to the Ark, which gameplay-wise functions very similar to the Void that could be visited during the Haunted by Daylight events in the past. While in the Ark, the survivor is able to fully recover from the dying state and, once recovered, can choose to jump into the Ark's center to be delivered back to the map at the opposite end from the killer. If the survivor in the Ark is the last survivor, they are unable to leave, and the operator's Arc Walk ability changes to Enter the Ark. This allows the operator to travel to the Ark, also gaining the ability to Mori the survivor with a special Mori exclusive to the Ark, similar to Pyramid, Hedda, and Sodico's second Moris. This also prevents the survivor from holding the match hostage by refusing to leave the Ark when they are the last survivor. The idea of this ability is to give the operator natural slowdown through the tagging system, while making it more skill-expressive by rewarding game sense, incentivizing the killer to tag the farthest away survivor who is most likely to be on gens that aren't as easily patrolled, switching the tag from survivor to survivor based on who is the farthest away at the time. This ideally makes it not too overbearing on the survivors, while also covering some weakness for the killer in a skill-expressive way. Thematically, it utilizes the operator's sickness and the arc, with the arc allowing for a unique Mori as both a lore addition and a reward of sorts for the killer. The Mori animation could even be a continuation of the base Mori in some way. The default Mori could end with the operator and the survivor vanishing, as if it has taken them to the arc, while the arc Mori could show what happens to them after they vanish. The operator's third and final ability is called Cold Grasp, and serves as the killer's anti-loop and chase power. Pressing M2 causes the operator to lunge forward and grab any survivor within a range that extends a bit farther than a basic attack, and reaches over pallets and windows. If a survivor is grabbed, the operator can choose to throw the survivor away from himself with M1, or to pull the survivor toward himself with M2, which can pull a survivor over a pallet or through a window. If the operator does not choose, the survivor can struggle free using a 3-second interaction, which briefly stuns the operator. After throwing or pulling the survivor, the operator is briefly slowed and cannot attack for a short time, and the survivor is unable to vault or drop pallets for a few seconds, similar to an extended doctor shock. The idea of this ability is an anti-loop that does not grant free hits for the killer, but instead relies on skilled plays from the killer to get hits from utilizing this ability, and requires skilled plays from the survivor to avoid being hit after being snagged by the operator, while also avoiding the operator being an M1 killer with no anti-loop. Like the arc-walking ability, it borrows from killers like Wesker and Deathslinger, without being truly redundant by varying the effect of the grab and being able to work over pallets with the trade-off of not guaranteeing a health state. Also, to be completely honest, I think it would result in some pretty funny interactions, and that can be a very good thing to have in a killer power. I know that, for many people, funny interactions can cause much more enjoyment in the game. And that's the operator's power. Though it is by no means a perfect design, I believe that it stays true to the source material while also having the potential for good plays on both sides. It isn't overbearing, and it isn't brain dead. Overall, I think it has a good balance to it, and with some number tweaks, it could be even better. I don't want to spend an extensive amount of time discussing add-ons, especially because they tend to be number tweaks I've already admitted I have no real clue about. Numbers aren't my thing. However, I have some ideas for add-on names, as well as ideas for a meme add-on and 2 iridescents that change the power in some way, though I'm not sure how they would be balance-wise. I will put them on the screen now, and you can feel free to pause and look them over if you want. With that out of the way, let's move on to the other half of any full Dead by Daylight chapter, the Survivor. When it comes to options for a survivor counterpart to the operator, there's no shortage of options. Dead by Daylight's characters tend to be taken when they're dying, or at a point where it would be natural for them to disappear in their home series. Pretty much every character fits this category, as any dead character ends up sent to the Ark, and they're all quite isolated regardless of their fate. Jay makes a lot of sense. He was the main character up until the tail end of Season 3 and was taken to the Ark after his death. There isn't much to say about him as an option other than that he would fit the bill. Jessica makes sense too. Despite her being alive and well in the currently ongoing comic series, it wouldn't be completely out of character for behavior to pull a survivor from the middle of a series and subsequently alter the continuity with their version of the character. However, despite her involvement with the operator, I don't think she's a particularly good pick with respect to the source material, due to her story still being unresolved and ongoing, as well as there being other characters who have much more involvement in the overall story. Tim is similar to Jessica. He would make sense as well, being a sort of antagonist of the first 2 seasons, a deuteragonist of the third, and eventually the main protagonist toward the end of the series as he takes over for Jay. He's also a fan-favorite character with a lot of depth, and he's more deeply tied to the operator than the other characters, as it has been part of his life since he was a child. He is not only alive at the end of the series, though, but is doing his best to move on, and while taking him to the realm after this would be characteristically cruel for the entity, it also feels like it would undermine the ending of the series in a way. Besides, I think there are 3 more candidates who are far better options to choose from. Alex is one such candidate. He was driven insane by the operator, died at the end of the series, and it would make sense to pair him with the Operator, as he was essentially the Operator's chosen one of sorts, with it using him to feed the Ark and protecting him from the To the Ark group. He's a complicated character with a lot of potential to be the Survivor counterpart to the Operator, though I believe he doesn't make quite as much sense as the next two options, due to the fact that while he seemed to believe he was working against the Operator the whole time, it was very clearly using him as a tool. Making him a Survivor working against the Operator wouldn't make a great deal of sense. Another option is Scully. He's tied to the Operator very closely due to also being a supernatural creature related in some way to the Ark. Scully works against the Operator directly by absorbing its victims, removing its food source to starve the Ark. I also had a cool idea where I thought about giving Scully the ability to equip any Survivor's head cosmetic that the player owns, as a reference to his ability to change his face to those of the people he absorbs. But overall, I have many of the same issues with Scully that I have with Jessica. Namely, his part in the series is still ongoing, and Scully doesn't have a smooth way to fit into Dead by Daylight lore-wise because of that. No, instead I believe there is one single choice that makes the most sense. The Hooded Man, also known as Brian. Brian is an incredibly complex and interesting character. His spiral into madness because of the Operator's influence is entirely off-screen, leaving us with what is essentially a before and after comparison. From a goofy and cheerful friend of Alex, to the stalker who repeatedly hacked Jay's account and tormented every living member of the cast in one way or another, Brian showcases exactly what the Operator can do to someone in such a short amount of time. He doesn't appear outright until Season 2, but on rewatch his presence is felt from almost the very beginning. He would even fit right into Dead by Daylight lore-wise. He died from severe fall damage in the series, and was brought back in comic issue 3.5, a prequel to the other comics, only to be absorbed by Scully in the end. Brian could be the entire lore reason for the Operator's presence in the realm. The entity took him as he was dying on the ground, and the Operator followed, connected to him, like the infection it is. I'd imagine the Ark and the entity would have a sort of deal similar to the Mind Flayer in the Demogorgon's lore. The Ark allowing the Operator's presence as long as it still gets fed semi-frequently, which would happen via Mori. Overall, I think Brian is the best choice for the Operator's Survivor counterpart. He smoothly transitions from his source material into the lore of the game, and even fits the game thematically as a character who's been haunted by monsters before, making the ideas of the realm familiar to him in a way. Now that we have the two characters for the chapter, we can move on to everyone's other favorite point of contention in every chapter: the perks. This section is going to be brief, and I'm not going to explain each perk in depth because while a perk should fit thematically, it has to be far more lenient in order for it to be balanced around everything that role has at its disposal. Survivor perks have to account for teammates, items, and every other perk. Killer perks have to be balanced across every killer without regard to an individual killer's power level. A perk that would make trappers slightly more viable could be gutted simply because Nurse exists. Therefore, I'm only going to touch on the general theme and purpose of each perk so that it could potentially be changed to the point where the only thing that stays the same is the name and icon. Once again, numbers are practically guesswork, and in this case, were sometimes taken from other perks with similar functions in the hope that it remains in a state of semi-balance. Amnesia. This perk revolves around the Operator's unpredictability and somewhat stealthy nature. The idea is to remove Survivor's awareness in some way after an encounter with the killer, working on an individual basis necessitating the usage of Oblivious on the Survivor rather than Undetectable on the killer. Always Watching. This perk is an information perk that emphasizes the Operator's nature as a distant observer, constantly in the background and keeping tabs on the survivors no matter where or when. Aura Reveal is more precise tracking than killer instinct or location indicators, allowing the killer to judge distance more easily and giving the killer a better idea of what exactly the survivor is doing. Chilling Presence. This perk is a stealth perk in the same vein as Unforeseen and Dark Devotion, used for the purpose of disorienting survivors and causing confusion as to the true location of the killer. However, instead of the killer performing an action and starting a timer that grants Undetectable for the duration, this perk relies on the killer either having Undetectable as part of their base kit, or using a perk that grants Undetectable in order for this perk to activate. This would be a good perk on Ghostface, for example, while others may not get as much value naturally and would need to equip a perk like Trail of Torment in order to activate it. It would also synergize with the Operator's Arc Walk ability. Now we move on to Brian's perks. Regards. This perk is designed not to help the individual survivor, but instead meant to help the survivors as a whole make a comeback in situations that look tough, by assisting the survivors who are currently in a disadvantaged state. In a situation where a survivor is slugged, or no one is near the hook apart from the person being chased, the perk can grant that extra push needed to rescue the downed or hooked survivor, or allows the team to help while you're preoccupied. Advocate. This perk is the effects of several perks in one, meaning it may need to be toned down, such as having vigils effects or the infamous mid-phase haste. But, to balance this out, it can only happen once the survivor with the perk is dead, and its stats cannot stack with itself or other perks with the same stats. So if multiple people bring it, it's a waste of anywhere from 1 to 3 perk slots across the team. The idea is for the survivor to buff the team in their own absence once the game starts snowballing to slow that additional pressure by just a bit. In order to gain these advantages, 25% of the team must be lost.
Extraction. This perk was by far my favorite idea out of all of these perks conceptually. It's mostly meant to be a fun perk, but it has utility when you are being proxy camped or your teammates are too far away to get you before you reach another hook stage or die. Its original concept was to have hooks be blocked by the entity based on recovery progress when downed, but I think this is a better idea, if not funnier. The basic idea behind this perk is to have an entity interaction with trial elements in the same way that it blocks pallets, breaks pallets, blocks windows, blocks generators, blocks gates, blocks totems, and even blocks chests. Now it can interact with hooks too. All that's left is lockers. Joking aside, the perk idea revolves more around having an entity-based interaction in favor of the survivor, similar to the idea of Repressed Alliance, and is another perk that has utility while also being naturally funny, similar to Plot Twist. Now that the perks are done, I wanted to throw one last chapter element out there that's a lot less necessary, but would still be cool in my opinion. A map. Marble Hornets is full of interesting set pieces that would make for equally interesting maps if balanced properly. The college with Benedict Hall that acts as the scenery for the major events of the final few entries would be an option. The other main locations of the series are Rosswood Park from Seasons 2 and 3, and the burned-out hospital from Season 3. Rosswood Park has several key locations and landmarks, such as the Red Shed, the building Alex attacks Jay and Jessica in, the overgrown chimneys in the field, the big tree in the center, and of course the infamous tunnel. The hospital is important to the story and appears several times in the final stretch of entries. The two could even be combined as maps, since the operator tends to mess with space in weird ways. The tunnel, small overgrown buildings, and even part of the hospital could all be sections of the map with the Red Shed as the killer shack, and I think this could be a pretty interesting combination for scenery for the chapter. Overall, I don't have many thoughts about the potential for a map, just ideas for what locations it could be based on. And that's Dead by Daylight, the Marble Hornets chapter as conceived by yours truly. As it stands, I think this is a really amazing concept and would be a great alternative to the Slenderman paragraph people have been requesting, with a more complete feel to it and a solid piece of source material to look at for inspiration rather than scattered versions throughout the internet to look through without a coherent character to derive the chapter from. Honestly, Behavior, if you ever see this and you can make it happen, I'd gladly tweak this and help with development in any way I can. I don't know how the creators of the series would respond to a request for their characters and series to be used in Dead by Daylight, but it's always worth a shot, right? I'm not entirely certain about the balance of everything I've discussed, but overall, I think the concept and general ideas would work well for the game. It might not all be perfect, but all things considered, I think